the biggest challenge on the manufacturing and that folks like those companies have is that 73% of OT devices are still unmanaged, right? So from an endpoint
which is staggering if you think
it's staggering. I mean, so the visibility you have of what's truly going on, right, outside of maybe just HVAs or potential high-value assets in your environment is pretty scary.
Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and have the privilege this week to sit down with Bill Rucker. Bill is a seasoned veteran of the IT and cybersecurity space over 25 years. He is currently president of Trustwave Government Solutions, and they just came out with a new report focused on the manufacturing sector, and really look forward to diving in and getting a great snapshot and going deep on some of these issues. Bill, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to start with your first sentence of the report, and that talks about how cybersecurity in the manufacturing sector is complex. And we all know 17 sectors, they all look a little different, but they all share some similarities. What I thought would make sense is to paint the scene, let our viewers know what makes the sector unique, different, and any thoughts you'd like to tee up to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. And these threat reports are great. They come out of our Spider Labs organization. By way of a background, a little bit just on myself. So I've been with Trustwave since 2010. They acquired a company called IntelliTactics. So I come up on 25 years this August with the organization. Boom. And then Trustwave Government Solutions became a wholly owned subsidiary of the organization in 2015. And that division purely focuses on the federal government. And so also the DIB community and some of the SLED or people that have unique requirements like our federal government customers. Our organization looks just like the rest of the global organization. We have Spider Labs organizations, we have managed services, we have delivery consultants. So we're just an arm within that has all those unique requirements, has all the specific clearances, background investigations, et cetera, that we would need to be able to service that public sector environment. Because of that, we do work in the manufacturing space as well. So we have customers that may be involved with shipbuilding. They may be building parts that go into very strategic things that our Department of Defense uses, and so they have unique requirements. Digging into these threat reports, and we do more than this manufacturing. It's actually the second time we've done the manufacturing report. We did this in 2023 as well. So it's great to actually see the differences from what we did 2 years ago to now, and I'll talk about some of those differences. And the biggest one is really the impact of the breach in that environment. The average cost of breach in 2023 for the manufacturing sector was about $4.7 million. That's closer to 5.8 now. Wow. So it increased over 20% in just 2 years. And it's actually higher than the overall average of breach, which is, I think, 5.6 million now. So there's definitely a threat there from that regard. And the biggest issue, too, in manufacturing is the legacy devices and the fact that there's now such a push to take OT devices and put them into
net them up on IoT,
OT SOC convergence. And I've been to a couple events recently that really focus on the OT OIT environment, and they're still really struggling with how do they take the telemetry of such a unique environment where it really was about production and uptime, not so much the resiliency and cybersecurity where the IT people have had in the past. So there's a lot of conflicts really on how that environment and how the traditional SOC environment will kind of work together. And because of that, it makes the manufacturing report pretty unique in that. And I think the other thing that we'll see is there's a lot of similarities around the actual cyber threat that's making the impact. Of the attacks that we saw in manufacturing, 54% of those were actually U.S.-based entities. And that was up a little bit from what we'd seen before. But surprisingly, I think the data point that I thought that was really interesting is that 87% of those attacks all came from phishing. So across the board, whether we're looking at our education report we did, the public sector report we did, I think there was retail, healthcare, as well as supply chain, phishing remains to be always number one or number two. Yeah. It's an easy access
phase one.
There's a reason people do phishing tests every month because everyone from the low-level admin to the CEO will click on something if it piques their interest and there's a news event. So it's just a very easy way for adversaries to still gain access to environments.
And that is consistent across all the sectors you've examined, right?
That we've seen, absolutely. If it's not in the top 3, then it's a sector that wouldn't necessarily be deemed relevant, honestly, from a market perspective.
Roger that. Or and what about dwell time? Not to jump right in, have you seen big shift in terms of by the time a breach is noticed and how to remediate?
Yeah, a massive change. I mean, if you go back, not even that long ago, 5 years, it was still at 177 days, I think was the dwell time. Now it's sub 10 days in the last 2 years. And that's really because of the explosion of EDR technology. So the telemetry that you have now as a cybersecurity professional, especially as a cybersecurity service provider from an MSSP perspective, the EDR telemetry gives us the ability to see things on the endpoint in real time, where in the past was really just leveraging almost the edge, or sometimes, if you were lucky, a log server. If they were really innovative and really mature, they might have had a SIM solution, but you weren't able to see something, go directly to the endpoint, pivot, and then kick off a threat hunt and see where else that had gone. So the dwell time now is much better for the good guys. But that's just made the adversaries get better, right? And smarter and pivot
and more incidents.
And so the threat hunting aspect that has evolved out of that has helped lower that dwell time a little bit more. Every threat hunt we've done with this new platform, regardless of the fact if there's an EDR solution or a SIM, we've found something that was unknown to the environment and unknown to those devices. There's things that you just can't necessarily detect if the adversary has a really good or smart approach.
Yeah, and we recently had Rob Lee, who's CEO of Dragos, on, and he was talking about new malware specifically targeting the OT sector. And we had Tom Fanning on talking about some of the IT-OT convergence issues. And you had mentioned, and I want to sort of peel the onion a little bit here, and hopefully not cry if I peel it too much. but I mean, culturally, there are big differences between the IT environment and the OT environment, and you capture that, I think, very well in the report. OT very focused on public safety, traditional emergency response and security. I think preventing 3-mile aisles. IT focused a little differently. How does that impact sort of that IT-OT sets of challenges, and specifically in manufacturing, where you do have legacy devices, some of which are 30 years old, deployed? So what are your thoughts there?
So great data points, and you mentioned the one of the technologies, Dragos, in this space. And so I was just recently attended S4 by 25, and it's just a phenomenal OT event that they have annually. And you'll have everyone from Nozomi and Dragos and Clarity, so the major players in that OT space are there. And there's a lot of discussion still on how do you take those relatively newer technologies. I mean, all of them are 2 or 3 years old, right? Maybe 4 at the most, and integrate them into the contextual adaptation into the SOC, right? And so the biggest challenge on the manufacturing and that folks like those companies have is that 73% of OT devices are still unmanaged, right? So from an endpoint
which is
perspective,
staggering if you think
it's
about
staggering. I mean, so the visibility you have of what's truly going on, right, outside of maybe just HVAs or potential high-value assets in your environment, is pretty scary in that regard. And you have scenarios where something that you might consider the least likely to be a problem, like a camera, for example, in your environment. We've had organizations in the Spider Labs groups to where they've gone into an environment to do a penetration test, and it's been a very secure environment. Impressive. Things are locked down. There's technology on the endpoint. The firewalls are up to date. The right ports are turned off. And yet they look at the rest of the environment, what's open, and they find a network of cameras. And those cameras are very well organized all the way down to whose office is what, and then you can
often hike vision, so cameras are concerned.
All the way to where you could type in titles, and you could type in CEO, CFO, COO, go right to their office. And if you're patient and you have screen recording, you can capture their password by just looking at the keyboard, right? Depending on the angle of the camera. So we were able to compromise a very secure environment because of an OT flaw, right? They just had this camera system, which they just deemed, a security control for physical security, and it became a major IT threat.
Do you know anyone who's sort of, and I know you have experience in SOCs, and most people think of a SOC in an IT environment. You also have OT SOCs. Have you seen anyone combine those where you get true visibility?
We have two very specific and unique pilots in our current customer base. One's a little bit more advanced than the other. And they are a very, very large OT environment. They
utility?
Initially, not in the utility, in the transportation space.
Okay.
They initially had merged kind of their cyber operations, next generation SOC and OT together. Those plans changed a little bit when they realized just some of the challenges that would exist to try to do that on phase one. So those got split apart. You go fast forward a year into them really revolutionizing their SOC, getting automation, integrating AI, ML, and having kind of 24/7 eyes on glass, all advancement for them. Now it's like, okay, what can we do from an OT perspective? And they're making phenomenal progress. None of it's as fast as us as a solution provider would want or they would want, but there's just inherent limitations still on how you get the right telemetry from everything, because some of the
measure
OT,
apples and apples, right?
Some of the OT technologies work in certain environments, but not in others. And so, where one provider might provide context on X part of the environment, they can't see Y part of the environment. So getting a collaborative to where those telemetries and really that common event format comes into a SIM or some type of automation to where you can correlate and do something valuable with that data, that's where it becomes very difficult. We've been doing that for cyber data sources for decades.
For a long time, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But at some point that needs to happen, doesn't
Has
it?
to,
I mean, if you're briefing an executive or the C-suite, at the end of the day, a picture can say 1,000 words and more,
Right.
and it can actually justify budgets too. So until you can sort of articulate and communicate and visualize some of these issues collectively, I think we're not as far along as we would hope to be. Is that fair?
Yeah, and you hit on one of the biggest
And I'm biased and I'm leading the witness, so
but you hit on one
please
of the
feel
things,
free to shoot back.
the OT skills gap. I mean, let alone
Boom.
the cybersecurity skills gap. The
Yep.
OT skills gap is massive, right?
Yep.
And a couple of the data points that we had in our report that we pulled out, there were just over 4,000 unique vulnerabilities of the 25,000 public exposed vulnerabilities that were specific to manufacturing, right? According to a report out of CISA. 3,800 of those were deemed critical vulnerabilities.
On their
That's
KEV list.
Correct. Yeah,
Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
15% of the known of the overall list and the majority of the list of vulnerabilities. So to say that it's not a critical threat would be an understatement. The one thing that's interesting is I consider myself from 25 years in cyber to know quite a bit about that. And so when I went to the first OT event I had been to, dedicated OT event in 2024, I was like, this will be straightforward. I'll understand this easily. I remember walking out of the first two sessions going, I don't know anything about OT. So it's definitely been a journey for us. And the fact that we now have multiple assessments that help people, where are you on your OT journey? Where do you need to get to? What would we recommend based on what we've seen? And kind of where is it going? Because all of the major providers are adding some level of OT context to their cyber plan. But the telemetry from the people that have been doing OT for a while is getting better and better, and it's getting more and more security usable context. Where in the past it was really, am I up? Am I breathing? Am I alive?
And that's still going to be their priority historically, right?
It will
is
be,
uptime.
right?
Yeah.
But when you can shut off a valve and poison a water
joke.
treatment center,
No joke.
that's when the real life happens.
Absolutely. And this may be a bad analogy,
Sure.
but I look at it similarly to FEMA and CISA within the Department of Homeland Security. One's a little more emergency response, preparedness, resilience. Resilience should be the banner around everything. The other is going to be more cyber threat hunt, EDR, all the bells and whistles that come around cyber. And you see some of the same challenges in companies, and sometimes it's through a chief security officer, sometimes it's through a chief information security officer, and rarely do the two fully come together. And I just have to think that's the future. Whoever figures out how to do that and articulate it and ensure that the cultures are aligned to meet the mission objectives of an organization, whether company, government, whatever it is.
Right.
That's sort of where I think we need to be.
I agree on that, and it is different from manufacturing versus government too, because you think about the number one threat outside of how they get compromised. So the result of that phishing becomes ransomware, right? And when you look at the threats of ransomware into those groups, one of the challenges is do they take the threat from a cost perspective and mitigate it because they've done all the right things, they have secure backups, they've put all those controls in place? 9 times out of 10, they haven't, right? And so that's why you see a lot more of those ransom paid in certain market segments than others. And
especially where you need to be up.
100%.
Yeah.
And honestly, the general public, many people outside of IT cybersecurity, maybe 10% of them knew what ransomware was until Colonial Pipeline.
Yep.
But all of a sudden, you're in a line of 50 cars trying to get gas, and they're saying there's no gas because there's an IT issue or a cybersecurity issue. I mean, that was an example where it really brought the public kind of into the fold, and they saw for the first time what the impact of an actual ransomware or cybersecurity attack on a very vital production all the way up and down the East Coast could actually have.
Absolutely. And when you think of manufacturing in particular, the intentions as well as the methods or the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the adversary are going to be a little different because it is that OT dependency. And I do think that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. And the sector as a whole is lagging, comparatively speaking. Your report has underscored. Would you agree with that? I think you would, since it was in your report, but I'd be curious what thoughts you have there. And I don't mean to be negative in terms of lagging, but it is behind other sectors.
It is, and some of the things that have been easy to do for a long time aren't easy to do in the OT world. And you look at something that, major programs in the federal government, if you go back and think about the CDM program, for example, all the way back to 2010 and 2011, one of the initial goals of that 15 years ago was asset inventory. Where are all my critical devices? Which ones are high value assets? Where are they? How can you defend and protect what you don't know exists? That's really the forefront of where OT is on the manufacturing side, because again, they're unknown or unmanaged devices today, and there's not a really good approach to asset inventory from OT. What qualifies, right? Is it everything up into including door badge systems all the way down to a valve in a water system? There's a lot of work that needs to be done to define what's critical and what's not when it comes to what are we going to integrate into the SOC, what's relevant, because you have to have the telemetry has to have actionable intelligence, right? We used to have a lot of folks in our cybersecurity work in both the civilian government and the DoD. They'd look at a specific screen and say, okay, that's great. I see lots of trends and bars and stuff, but where's the so what? Exactly. Where's the actionable thing that tells me what to do or not to do or what step to take next? That's extremely difficult to do when you have potentially lives on the line, production lines going down, and that changes the game.
No, that sums it up, I think, very well. And at the end of the day, the adversary gets a vote in all this too, right? So what we may think is essential may be a vulnerability that's being exploited as part of a broader campaign.
Right, and they only have to be right once.
And they are clearly thinking cyber as one instrument and tool in a broader campaign effort, especially when we're dealing with state actors, nation-state actors.
Absolutely.
The Chinas, the Russias, the Irans, the North Koreas, and I like to say what we see overseas is often a movie coming to a theater near you here, so it has relevance. Those are their practice fields.
They are, and again, with systems that are connected in ways that we don't fully understand, and may not fully understand what the mapping of connectivity from one OT system is to another. One system's compromised, and then it goes into an actual managed OT system, and then that has connectivity to your IT environment. So something that would seem like a non-credible target all of a sudden is massively credible, and now you're on the network moving laterally. And if you're able to, again, we talked about the phishing, if you have credentialed access, I mean, you can live, you talk about dwell time, I mean, that's a hard one to measure, because if you have credentialed access as an adversary, you can kind of move at free will, with the exception of some of the anomaly detections and things that are out there. You can do a lot of damage in a very short period of time, or put things in place that allow you to come back in very easily, and then you exit, and nobody knows the difference.
Exactly, and that was the big takeaway from Volt Typhoon and living off the land and pre-positioning. And when you think of OT devices and when you think of manufacturing, those are pre-positioned, could have little value in a traditional ransomware, crime, even espionage perspective, but can have massive implications in a campaign.
And the ability to get credentials from the average user environment, so that when I think
it's about upping the credential, right?
You can absolutely elevate privileges if you have the right level of access when you go in. But the number of active and current credentials that are for sale every single day. One of the things that we do when we meet with
do you do deep web darknet
we do. Yep.
You do?
Yes, we have some folks that live in certain parts of the world and certain forums, right? And then we do a lot of dark web research, either proactively for our customers or on demand through a threat intelligence as a service platform. And that's unique because that's a very curated threat intelligence solution that's really built for the segment and the market and the mission of that entity, right? So if they're in the energy space, and a government entity, we'll look at very specific things, up to including kind of what their domains are, and then what are the users of that, and where can we actually find that domain on the dark web. I've yet to see a single threat intelligence report where there wasn't thousands of credentials on the dark web, and we find on average that 15 to 20% of those are active credentials.
Wow.
Still employed, same username, same password.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. And as bad as that is, I promise you that's still only the tip of the iceberg.
100%.
Depends which chat rooms you're in and which where on the deep web darknet you are. But that is a scary thought.
But it is exciting that we're able to get that data
to
now,
illuminate
right? And be able to warm some of those
Exactly.
folks. I mean, because a lot of that, sometimes people are aware because their threat intelligence teams are much better than they used to be. But other times it's just a misconfiguration. It was a mistake, but it's out there and people know about it. And then they put it out there for other folks that maybe want to do bad things to actually find and then leverage as a way to infiltrate an environment. So the more we can do that work to share, and that's a big part of it, is the information sharing on it. And the data that DivNet provides us, the data we provide back to them, same with CISA's JCDC and those collaborations. Those are all advancing the cyber game because now we're able to take that back to customers that we provide services for. We're able to share that back to our partners that we're in their supply chain. It is a team sport at the end of the day. You have to be able to share that information regardless of being a co-opetition or competitor to one of the other providers.
Need to share will trump the need to know, and in many of these cases, as long as you're not compromising obviously sources and methods.
Right.
But I think that is still a cultural challenge for some in our intelligence community, and then you've got other civilian entities that are responsible for sharing and the like. But to me, that's where the rubber hits the road, and all the talk about public-private partnerships. I like to say long on nouns, short on verbs, but we've got to go beyond just the information sharing to the action, and that's where nothing like being in the same foxhole, fighting the same fight against a particular adversary. And do you feel? Have you seen anything from an adversarial TTP or tactics, techniques, procedures perspective where? Let's take China, Russia off the table for a second. Maybe Iran, North Korea as well. They're all very different too. But
absolutely,
are you starting to see human-enabled where human and technical and cyber int and cyber means are combining from a criminal perspective?
We've always seen that in, if you go way back to Trustwave's legacy, right, in the PCI space or the payment card industry, we saw that type of threat being, from a financial criminal perspective quite a bit. Now the aspect that we see the most from a criminal aspect is just truly the ransom groups, right? So when you look at Ransom Hub and Play, I believe are the two that were identified as the top two ransomware groups or adversarial groups that were threats in the manufacturing space. They're all uniquely different. They all do have their own kind of methods and unique TTPs on how they act, which is actually really good.
Insiders utilized? That's what I was really getting at there with human tech. And so
on our side, we probably haven't seen that as much. It's certainly something that
you think about.
Our customers ask us about, but it's always a secondary. If you don't have 24/7 eyes on glass and your ability to actually defend threats after 5 p.m. and before 9 p.m., the insider thing is important, but not as important as some of those other big rocks. So it's all about that maturity journey. Some are definitely way more advanced, and we help them kind of with that insider threat program and the monitoring of that and how they can kind of report that up, especially in the DIB space. On the government side, I don't want to say it's an afterthought, but it's certainly not the focus for most of the ones we're engaged with. They really want to get how can
agnostic
I say,
to how, they just want to keep it
how
out.
can I get my MTTA and my MTTR under 15 and 30 minutes so that I can actually be an operational SOC next generation, right? And leverage all of these new kind of hybrid operations and having global threat operators, anywhere in the United States so that I can quote unquote follow the sun, but be CONUS and have a platform that allows me to do that with an analyst that knows what he's doing.
And I think there's still this stereotype of kids in hoodies drinking Jolt soda, which hasn't been around for years, so it shows you my age, going back to,
like
to the old hacker
twice the caffeine
movies.
and 3 times the sugar.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
But in reality, that's sort of where I think most. But these are criminal syndicates, and they're run like companies, and they and the consequences of going south is low for them. I mean, the threshold, the bar is very low. Very few are actually prosecuted. Many are provided safe haven in countries we lack extradition authorities with. How do we square that circle? It's a little bit of a policy question, but in the NDAA, and for transparency, we did a big report on transition priorities. We called for designating ransomware gangs and state sponsors of cybercrime. So basically to get to the lack of extradition set of issues, akin to where you have state sponsors of terrorism. But again, that's not going to necessarily operationalize all that. I'm just curious what we think we can do, because otherwise it's a bit of a fool's errand. We're always reacting.
True. And when I think about it, I separate typically the criminal versus the nation state.
And that's what I'm talking criminals now.
Yeah.
But you can't separate the proxies, because many of these actors are provided safe harbor.
Well, and many of them use the same tools, or they sell their tool to the same
as long as they're there to do their bidding when they want them.
And vice versa, right? And again, to give them that level of protection. I think it comes back to, and again, policy aside, I think it comes back to the data that we have independently could actually move the needle quite a bit, right? So that public-private partnership of information sharing that I kind of referenced earlier, we have data and IOCs and things that we see globally. Every pen test that we do, it's just over 2 million hours a year in penetration testing. Every incident response, breach investigation we do, we get additional data and metadata and IOCs. We probably don't, at the level we could, make sure that all of that information gets to some repository that I don't really believe exists today, right? So that information, again, you're talking the volumes are massive. Almost incomprehensible, but that would allow us to get better telemetry, better data on some of these threat actor groups. So when you start talking about the ability to at least know who they are and where they are, how we actually get them, how we take them down, what the policies are to make that happen are different. But today, many of those act in a way that we don't really know who they are or where they are. We think we do in many cases, but it's so easy to obfuscate who you are and where you are from a cyber perspective.
Absolutely. And I hate to say it, and I don't want to sound defeatist, but for now, the initiative does remain with the attacker. So
it does.
We've got to flip that equation at some point, but we're not there yet. And I think we're getting better and better and better. But if you look at it just from an outcome perspective, it's not a rosy picture. So
true. I mean, the adversarial threat has certainly never been greater. But if you look at our ability to respond today versus 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's volumes and volumes of improvement on what we're able to do today across both government and industry. Our ability to respond faster, just seeing the dwell times go down 90+%. It's not enough, of course, right? Because again, they have to be right once, they have to be right every single time, and that's nearly impossible. We always talk about it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. Right? From a compromise perspective.
Sounds like the old counterterrorism business.
But the ability to to have the playbooks in place, the ability to have run the tabletops and the instant response exercise, the ability to have already know who your strategic third-party partners are when it happens, right? Everything that's right of the boom, we're really getting better at that.
And
right?
how to communicate it to shareholder, internal,
Absolutely.
external, and the many stakeholders, to include shareholders or publicly traded
I think
companies.
that's one of the most critical parts. My
think so,
board
too.
sits in on our tabletop exercises.
awesome.
When we do that annually, they want to actually understand it. And then, if there's discussions, it's at a level of the exercise where there is going to be law enforcement or cyber insurance or those type of things engaged. There's always at what point do the members of the board get notified, and what level of communication do you do that, and how do you do it? And so if I go back to, I've had that same board ish for almost a decade. They weren't sitting through my tabletop exercises, 5-10 years ago, right? But for the last 3 or 4, they sit in every single one. So that definitely changes the mindset, their approach to, how secure are we as a service provider? Because that's my brand at the end of the day too. So if I'm compromised, how are people going to trust me with being a solution provider to their cybersecurity?
Absolutely. And that's beyond just the internal, external. You don't want to be exchanging business cards when the balloon goes up, right?
Correct.
You want to also know your partners, whether law enforcement, national security,
Of course.
public safety, you name it.
Who are those points of contact? Who's in your CSER?
And trust matters, right? It's still the coin of this realm and every other realm.
And how do you contact them, right? You got no email or your systems are down. How do you actually let your employees know what's going on? How do you let your key partners know what's going on?
One question I want to go back to, and then
Sure.
we're unfortunately running out of time. I could sit down for hours, as you can tell. I've never had an unspoken thought. But the skills gap issue.
Sure.
And in the IT and cyber environment, it's massive, and it's only larger in the OT environment because they've never necessarily thought of themselves in this orbit and world. What can we do? I mean, Idaho National Labs does some good work. They have an OT Defender program. It's career paths where
Correct, yeah.
cyber and security at least can be part of that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because we've spent a lot of time working on OT
Sure.
and actually training that workforce, but those numbers are onesies and twosies comparatively speaking.
Yeah, you mentioned INL, and then NREL, I think, partners with them on a similar scenario, though. So it's the challenge that we will continue to have. I mean, I think on the cybersecurity gap, I think last I saw it was it still said it was like 4.8 million was the standing cybersecurity gap, right? I've never seen the OT portion of that, right?
And
So
I don't
I've never
think
seen
you
the
will.
breakdown of that.
Do we want to see that? Yeah, we
I don't
actually
think-
need to know it, though.
We do, and so is it
Ignorance isn't
it's not
bliss.
going to double it, but it's going to be a material thing. The problem is, even though there's that skills gap, right? And so you look at all the College of Engineering and cybersecurity programs that have started around the United States in the last 3 to 5 years.
Like Auburn.
Yeah, tons of those, right? Like Auburn, a bunch of other ones that didn't exist 5+ years ago. So I do believe we're making a conscious effort to educate the next generation of folks, right? To be able to understand that. Where it'll be interesting to see is where will the importance of the OT aspect of that overlay?
Yep.
That I haven't seen yet. It's definitely been cybersecurity. This is a great profession. You can get a job right away. Pen testers are in demand. Become a threat hunter. These are things that are actually pretty exciting.
And
to
there are
folks.
career paths,
100%.
but not on the other side and
Right.
not integrated.
Yeah, and it's not an IT. You're going to the College of Engineering and with a
Exactly.
focus in cybersecurity. So it's the level of, I guess, respect's probably the wrong word, but like the level of respect of going into cybersecurity is different now, right? Especially when you associate with the College of Engineering at most of these schools. That makes a big difference.
And the owner-operator needs to be there, or it will be the Rodney Dangerfield of cyber, and it can't afford that. So.
And I think there'll be more funding in and around that. So my son's currently looking at colleges right now, and one of the things that was interesting is the number of College of Engineering who actually wants to get into cybersecurity that were providing funding, right? And say, hey, this school, we're going to give you X because of that discipline. It wasn't because of his grades, it wasn't because of where he lived or his background. It was because of the fact that he was going into a specific field. That's a great sign for me to be able to see that that's the response coming out of the university.
And scholarship for service, all these initiatives are essential. Before I ask my last question, I can't let you go. AI, ML, where do you see it fitting in? your 2-minute version, your elevator pitch.
It will
Good guy, bad
change. Gosh, it's interesting. So it will revolutionize the SOC. What we've been able to do with ML in security operations and hybrid kind of SOC as a service and MDR, has, we've been able to do in 6 months what took us 3 years.
Wow.
It's just, there's so many known scenarios, known incidents that you can effectively automate. We refer to it sometimes as tier 0 analysts. Some other folks do that as well. That ability to leverage that information and those large language models is phenomenal and will continue to change the game. The AI aspect of that, to be able to not only see the situation, but see a situation that also happened that's similar to it and take action based on a run book and traffic light protocol, will take the security operations center to where honestly tier 0 and 1 and almost part of 2 can be automated to a degree within a majority of an environment, with the exception of critical assets, high value assets.
U.S. companies ahead, you think, of the rest of the pack, or is that getting close?
I think we do a very good job on that. I mean, there's certainly concerns around
mostly because of application, or you think it's the LLMs and
I think it's
both?
Mostly because of we've been doing certain things very well in a very manual process from a SOC perspective for a long time. So our run books, our playbooks, we've been there, done that, kind of know it. So the ability to take all of that context, all of that knowledge, all of that metadata and data, and put it into a place to where we can leverage it for automation. I think that gives us a benefit from entities that have been doing cyber globally, right? From that perspective, the AI piece of it will continue to evolve, right? I think
and that can leapfrog from both the blue defender perspective if they're smart, but also adversarially, right?
Well, and so the flip side to this coin is everything that we can do faster, better,
So
automate it. The ability for I think about the social pen testing from a social engineering standpoint. The fact that you can now pick up the phone and call someone, and through the app sound like Frank. Giving you a call. We've got the show. We're doing that, and you cannot tell the difference. All you need to say is
yes or no, and they got it, and they're using it.
And whether that's credential harvesting or stealing identities, or the ability to just have someone take an action or make a configuration change, that will continue to be an issue, because again, they have to be right one time. They have to get one person to make one mistake, one misconfiguration. So
just like spam, you can send 1 billion. All you need is 1 or 2, and it's good day, right? There's no
Nigerian
cost.
prince, and you're in.
There you go. Bill, what questions didn't I ask that I should have?
Oh wow. I think from us is I kind of touched on it earlier. It's like what can we do to continue to move the needle, to get better. For me, when I think about cyber and the partnerships, it comes down to that particular word. So I think about public-private scenarios. For us, the ability for folks to truly tell us where their pain is from a cyber perspective. That, in the past, people have been reluctant to kind of expose and say, hey, I've been compromised here. I have this weakness there. Our best relationships, where we've had the most phenomenal outcomes with our customers and partners, is when people are transparent. And we take that same approach. Hey, here's where we can help you right away. Here's what will take a while on your cyber journey. But there's always immediate help for those folks if they're transparent, because they're all trying to solve some challenges that are not always easily solvable, but through partnerships and some of that transparent sharing, we can make a difference, right? And it's every single one of those small advancements will move our security needle further down.
And I'm really glad you underscored. At the end of the day, technology will always change, but human nature remains consistent for good or bad. And and it's going to take people to have trust and actually work together to get things done.
Bad news doesn't get better with time, right?
True
so
that.
Let's talk about what the challenges
If
are.
it bleeds,
and
it
figure
leads
out a path
too.
through it.
So there you go.
Right.
Bill, thank you for spending so much time with us.
Right.
Thank you for fighting the good fight. And,
Appreciate you having me.
And I'm glad you're in it. So thank you.
Thanks, Frank. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.